January 17, 1943. 30,000 feet above the Solomon Islands. The air at this altitude is thin enough to kill. At -40 degrees Fahrenheit, metal burns skin on contact, and breath freezes before it can fog a canopy. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most decorated fighter pilots with 64 confirmed kills, pulls his Mitsubishi A6M Zero into a climbing turn, chasing contrails that streak across the stratosphere like chalk on blackboard. His lungs burn. His vision tunnels at the edges, a familiar narrowing that comes with oxygen starvation at extreme altitude. He has learned to fight through it, as all Imperial Navy pilots have learned, pushing body and machine beyond what doctrine says is possible. But the American formation above him does not waver. The Lockheed P-38 Lightnings maintain their altitude, their twin-engine silhouettes sharp against the cobalt void. They do not descend to engage. They do not need to. And when Sakai finally reaches their altitude, his Zero shuddering with the effort, gasping for air in the stratosphere starvation, he sees something through his gun sight that fractures his understanding of aerial combat. The American pilots inside those cockpits are not struggling. Their movements are crisp, deliberate. They bank and weave with the precision of men breathing sea-level air. Small green tubes run from their faces to cylinders mounted in their aircraft. Oxygen, pure, pressurized oxygen, flowing freely at an altitude where Sakai's own body is beginning to shut down. He does not know it yet, but this moment, this visual confirmation of American technological abundance, will haunt him for the remainder of the war. It is not the shock of superior firepower or armor. It is something more intimate, more destabilizing, the realization that his enemy does not share his suffering. To understand the weight of this revelation, one must first understand the doctrine that shaped Japanese naval aviation in the years before Pearl Harbor. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was a masterpiece of minimalist engineering, designed under a philosophy that prioritized range, speed, and maneuverability above all else. Every ounce mattered. Armor plating was reduced to nearly nothing. Self-sealing fuel tanks, standard in American and British fighters by 1940, were deemed too heavy. Radios were often removed by pilots themselves to save weight. And oxygen systems, the bulky bottles, regulators, and masks that allowed sustained high-altitude flight, were considered an unnecessary luxury for an aircraft designed to dominate in the swirling knife fights of low-altitude combat. Japanese pilot training compensated for this through an almost monastic cultivation of physical endurance. Candidates for the Imperial Navy's flight program underwent selection processes that would have resembled torture in Western air forces. They were submerged in ice water to test cold tolerance. They were spun in centrifuges until blood vessels burst in their eyes. They held their breath underwater until unconsciousness threatened, learning to stretch each lungful of air beyond normal human limits. The philosophy was ancient, rooted in samurai tradition. The body is weak, but the spirit can transcend physical limitation. A pilot who could endure oxygen deprivation at 25,000 feet without mechanical assistance was not just saving weight for his aircraft. He was proving spiritual superiority over soft, technology-dependent Western airmen. This was not entirely unfounded. In the war's opening months, from December 1941 through mid-1942, Zero pilots ravaged Allied air forces across the Pacific. Over the Philippines, over Java, over Burma, the lightweight Japanese fighters climbed faster, turned tighter, and outranged everything they encountered. Allied pilots, accustomed to the comparative sluggishness of earlier generation aircraft, found themselves picked apart by an enemy who seemed to materialize from impossible angles, who could loop inside their turns, who could chase them down over distances that should have left the pursuers' tanks empty. The few reports that filtered back to American intelligence spoke of near-supernatural performance. Japanese fighters that could turn on a wingtip, that could climb vertically, that arrived over targets hundreds of miles from their carriers. But those early victories were won at altitudes where the Zero's lack of oxygen equipment was not yet a critical flaw. Most of the combat in the Philippines and Dutch East Indies took place below 20,000 feet, where brief periods of hypoxia could be managed through sheer determination and youth. Japanese pilots were typically in their early 20s, at the peak of cardiovascular fitness, capable of functioning through conditions that would incapacitate older or less conditioned men. They learned to recognize the symptoms, the creeping euphoria, the narrowing vision, the slowing of thought, and to compensate through practiced routine, through checklist discipline that became automatic even as the brain starved. What they did not anticipate was that the war would move upward. By late 1942, American tactical doctrine was undergoing rapid evolution. The early disasters, the destruction of the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, the surrender of the Philippines, the loss of the Asiatic Fleet, had forced a complete reassessment of equipment, training, and strategy. American aircraft designers, freed from the pre-war budget constraints that had forced compromises, began producing fighters that reflected a fundamentally different philosophy of air combat. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, introduced in January 1943, weighed nearly twice what a Zero weighed. It carried armor plating behind the pilot's seat and beneath the engine. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing, lined with rubber compounds that expanded to plug bullet holes. And every single production model included a full oxygen system, a high-pressure bottle, a demand regulator, and a mask that allowed pilots to operate comfortably at altitudes above 30,000 feet. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning went even further. With its twin turbocharged engines and pressurized cockpit options in later variants, the Lightning could patrol at altitudes where Japanese fighters literally could not follow for more than a few minutes without their pilots losing consciousness. American tactical bulletins from early 1943 explicitly recommended high-altitude patrol patterns for intercept missions, knowing that Japanese aircraft would have to climb into oxygen-starved air to engage, arriving with pilots already hypoxic, already impaired, already fighting their own bodies as much as the enemy. The contrast in logistics was equally stark. A single American P-38 squadron required oxygen bottles to be shipped forward in quantities that would have seemed absurd to Japanese supply officers. Hundreds of high-pressure cylinders, each weighing 40 pounds, delivered to forward airstrips at Guadalcanal, at Munda, at Bougainville. Specialized filling stations with compressors and filtration systems to ensure medical-grade oxygen purity. Mask fittings individually adjusted for each pilot. Backup regulators. Training protocols for recognizing equipment malfunction versus physiological hypoxia. The entire logistical tale of American air operations had thickened, burdened with equipment designed not to make pilots stronger or more skilled, but simply to make extreme altitude survivable. To Japanese aviators, this was both incomprehensible and quietly terrifying. Their own logistics were already stretched to breaking. The island-hopping advance across the Pacific was not just a geographic challenge. It was a mathematical impossibility being attempted anyway. Every gallon of fuel, every bullet, every can of rice had to be shipped thousands of miles through submarine-infested waters to bases that were themselves under constant air attack. The idea of adding oxygen bottles to that supply chain, of dedicating cargo space to equipment that existed solely to compensate for human weakness, was operationally inconceivable. Japanese pilots were told, in the formal language of military briefings, that oxygen systems would be provided when tactical requirements demanded. In practice, this meant almost never, and so they climbed without it. They climbed into air so thin that every breath felt like drowning in reverse. And they met American formations that flew in that killing altitude as casually as if they were at sea level, and the psychological impact of that disparity began to compound with every engagement. The physical effects of high-altitude hypoxia are well documented in aviation medicine. Above 18,000 feet, the partial pressure of oxygen in the lungs drops below the threshold required for efficient gas exchange. Hemoglobin in the blood, normally saturated with oxygen molecules, begins to shed its load. The brain, which consumes roughly 20% of the body's oxygen despite comprising only 2% of body mass, is among the first organs to suffer. Initial symptoms include euphoria and a sense of invulnerability, a dangerous condition that masks the onset of serious impairment. Pilots experiencing hypoxia often report feeling more confident, more capable, even as their reaction times slow and their decision-making degrades. Beyond 25,000 feet without supplemental oxygen, useful consciousness can be measured in minutes. At 30,000 feet, the altitude where American fighters increasingly patrolled by mid-1943, a human being has roughly 90 seconds of effective cognitive function before losing the ability to take corrective action. Beyond that threshold lies incapacitation. The body continues basic autonomic functions, heartbeat, breathing, but higher reasoning ceases. Pilots in this state have been observed performing nonsensical actions, adjusting non-existent controls, waving at hallucinated wingmen, gently steering their aircraft into fatal dives while smiling. Japanese training attempted to extend these windows through conditioning, and to some degree it worked. Veteran pilots like Saburo Sakai or Hiroyoshi Nishizawa could function at 28,000 feet for perhaps 5 or 6 minutes, long enough to attempt an intercept, fire a burst, and dive back into breathable air. But this came at a cost that was rarely discussed in official reports. The cumulative neurological damage from repeated hypoxic exposure manifests as subtle cognitive decline, slower processing speed, reduced spatial reasoning, memory gaps. Post-war studies of surviving Japanese pilots would reveal patterns of impairment consistent with repeated minor brain injury, though whether this stemmed from hypoxia, head trauma from combat, or the simple stress of prolonged warfare remained difficult to isolate. What is undeniable is that by 1943, Japanese pilots were encountering American formations that operated in an environment where their own effectiveness was systematically degraded. The Americans were not flying better aircraft? Exactly. Though they were flying heavier, tougher aircraft. They were flying from a position of physiological normalcy. They maneuvered with full oxygen saturation in their blood. They aimed with clear vision and steady hands. They made tactical decisions with unclouded judgment. And when combat turned against them, they could simply climb higher, ascending into altitudes where pursuit was suicide. This created a perverse tactical equation. Japanese pilots, knowing they could not sustain high-altitude combat, had to choose between two bad options: refuse engagement and allow American bombers to strike unmolested, or climb into oxygen-starved air to attempt interception, arriving at the fight already half defeated by their own physiology. Combat reports from the Solomon Islands campaign are filled with accounts of Japanese intercepts that began aggressively but dissolved into confusion as altitude hypoxia overwhelmed the attackers. American bomber crews described enemy fighters that approached in precise formation, only to scatter without completing their attack runs. Individual aircraft wandering off course, as if their pilots had forgotten what they were doing. They had. Their brains, starved of oxygen, were shutting down. But there was another dimension to this disparity, one that cut deeper than tactical disadvantage. The oxygen bottles in American cockpits represented something beyond mere technology. They represented a philosophical stance on the value of human life and capability that was fundamentally alien to the Imperial Japanese military structure. American oxygen systems were not just equipment. They were a statement that the individual pilot's life and effectiveness were worth the weight penalty, the logistical burden, the expense. Each oxygen bottle represented industrial capacity diverted from offensive weapons to life support. It represented supply chain resources allocated not to killing the enemy more efficiently, but to keeping one's own men functioning. In the calculus of American military planning, a pilot breathing pure oxygen at 30,000 feet was worth more than the weight of armor plating or ammunition that could have been carried instead. This was not sentimentality. It was cold mathematics of a particular kind. The mathematics of an industrial democracy that could afford to optimize for long-term effectiveness rather than short-term sacrifice. American pilot training took 18 months and cost the equivalent of the pilot's weight in gold by some estimates. Each trained aviator represented an enormous investment of national resources, one that was foolish to squander through preventable physiological incapacitation. If spending 200 pounds of aircraft weight allowance on oxygen equipment kept that investment alive and effective, the trade was obvious. Japanese military culture calculated differently. The pilot was expendable in ways that the aircraft arguably was not, given Japan's increasingly strained manufacturing capacity. If a pilot could extend his service life by 2 months through accepting higher physical risk, if he could complete 3 additional missions before incapacitation by foregoing safety equipment, that was considered an acceptable trade. The concept of acceptable losses in Japanese operations planning often included assumptions about aircrew endurance that would have been rejected as unrealistic by Western military medicine. And so the oxygen bottle, that green steel cylinder in the American cockpit, became a symbol of divergent national characters. To American pilots, it was simply part of the equipment checklist, as routine as checking fuel levels or ammunition loads. To Japanese pilots who glimpsed it through the canopy of an enemy aircraft, it represented something more troubling. Evidence of an opponent who did not share their willingness to sacrifice, who met the harsh realities of high-altitude warfare, not with spiritual fortitude, but with logistical abundance, and who was nevertheless winning. The memoirs of surviving Japanese pilots return again and again to this realization, though often obliquely. Saburo Sakai, in his post-war autobiography, describes an encounter over Bougainville where he pursued a damaged P-38 up to 32,000 feet, desperate to secure the kill. His vision was closing to a tunnel. His hands felt numb on the control stick. The P-38's right engine was trailing smoke. It should have been easy prey. But the American pilot continued to execute smooth, evasive maneuvers, climbing steadily, drawing Sakai higher into air that was becoming indistinguishable from vacuum. At the last moment before unconsciousness, Sakai broke off the attack and dove, gasping, back toward breathable altitude. I realized then, he wrote years later, that we were fighting men who brought their whole nation with them into the cockpit. They carried their factories, their supply ships, their training programs, all of it compressed into small advantages that accumulated until the weight was unbearable. We carried only our skill and our determination, and we discovered it was not enough. Another pilot, whose name was redacted from post-war interview records, described the psychological impact more bluntly. When you are at 28,000 feet and you cannot breathe, and you see the American above you, breathing easily, you understand that you are not fighting another pilot. You are fighting American industry. You are fighting American wealth. And you cannot win that fight with courage alone. This was the quiet crisis that began to spread through Japanese naval aviation in 1943, a crisis not of morale in the traditional sense, but of conceptual understanding. The early war narrative, the story that had sustained Japanese forces through the initial campaigns, held that spiritual strength and tactical excellence could overcome material disadvantage. The Zero's dominance had seemed to confirm this. A lightweight aircraft, flown by pilots willing to accept extreme personal risk, had devastated heavier, more expensive Western fighters. But the oxygen bottle was a kind of weapon that spiritual strength could not counter. It was not a gun that could be outmaneuvered or armor that could be penetrated with precise aim. It was environmental control, the ability to extend human performance into realms where sheer willpower failed. And as the war moved into its middle years, as combat increasingly took place at altitudes where breathing itself required technology, the philosophical foundation of Japanese air doctrine began to crack. The Americans, for their part, barely noticed the significance of what they possessed. Oxygen systems were so standard, so universal in U.S. aircraft by 1943 that they merited only brief mentions in after-action reports. Engaged enemy at 29,000 feet carried no special notation, no acknowledgement that such an engagement represented a domain where the enemy could barely function. Training manuals included oxygen system operation in the same matter-of-fact tone as landing gear operation. It was just what aircraft did. This casual abundance extended beyond aviation. American submarines carried ice cream machines. American infantry units received mail, with a regularity that seemed almost magical to Japanese troops accustomed to 6-month communication blackouts. American field hospitals had blood plasma in such quantity that it could be used freely without the agonizing triage decisions that Japanese medical officers face daily. Oxygen in a fighter cockpit was simply one more expression of a national economy that produced vast surpluses and could afford to distribute those surpluses all the way to the edge of the stratosphere. There is a particular kind of demoralization that comes from fighting an enemy who does not seem to be sacrificing. Japanese soldiers and pilots were accustomed to hardship as proof of seriousness, of commitment. They ate reduced rations not just because supply was difficult, but because deprivation was understood as a form of purification, a sharpening of spirit. American forces, by contrast, seemed to grow softer as the war progressed, better fed, better equipped, more casual in their interactions. Yet they kept winning. The cognitive dissonance was profound. In intelligence reports and captured documents from 1943 onward, Japanese analysts struggled to reconcile the contradiction. How could men who were issued chocolate bars and cigarettes alongside their ammunition, who had access to oxygen bottles as if air itself was something that could be packaged and distributed, who flew aircraft heavy with armor and survival equipment, how could such men be defeating warriors trained in deprivation and self-sacrifice? The question haunted Japanese strategic planning because it suggested that the entire foundation of their military philosophy might be flawed. Some officers clung to traditional answers. American material advantage was temporary. Their will would break. Their soft civilization could not sustain long-term sacrifice. But others began to voice heterodox thoughts. Perhaps material abundance was not evidence of spiritual weakness. Perhaps the ability to provide oxygen bottles to every pilot was not a sign of excessive caution, but of national strength so overwhelming that it could afford to keep its warriors alive. Perhaps the Americans were winning not despite their technology dependence, but because of it. These doubts were rarely expressed in official channels. The ideology of the Imperial Japanese military had no vocabulary for them, but they leaked through in small ways. In a quietly desperate emphasis on Bushido spirit in late-war pilot training, in increasingly explicit exhortations that willpower could overcome any material disadvantage, in the very shrillness with which oxygen deprivation was described as character-building rather than debilitating. The propaganda was louder because the underlying belief was faltering. By 1944, the oxygen disparity was compounding with other advantages. American pilots were now operating from aircraft carriers with fully equipped sick bays, rotating off combat duty for rest periods that allowed genuine recovery. Japanese pilots flew continuously until killed or injured so severely that they could not climb into a cockpit. American fighters incorporated lessons learned from combat into production models with startling speed. The F-6F Hellcat saw multiple internal revisions within its first year of service. Japanese industry, crippled by submarine blockade and strategic bombing, struggled to build even basic airframes. But the oxygen remained emblematic because it was so intimate. A pilot could rationalize being outgunned. Firepower was luck, positioning, skill. He could rationalize flying a more fragile aircraft. That was strategy, acceptable risk. But breathing was fundamental. When you climbed to 30,000 feet and your body shut down while your enemy remained functional, you were confronting not just military superiority, but biological augmentation. The Americans had purchased an extension of human capability through industrial means, and that purchase was effective. There were attempts to counter this. In late 1943, some Japanese squadrons began installing rudimentary oxygen systems in their aircraft, cobbled together from medical supplies and industrial gas bottles. The systems were inconsistent. Flow rates that worked for one pilot left another hypoxic, regulators that froze at high altitude, masks that leaked. But their existence was itself significant. They represented an admission, however grudging, that spiritual fortitude alone was insufficient. The body had limits. Technology could extend those limits. American doctrine on this point was correct. For pilots who had spent years training to transcend physical weakness, this was a kind of ideological defeat before the shooting even started. If you needed a machine to breathe for you at altitude, were you still proving spiritual superiority? Or were you admitting that the Americans had been right all along? That warfare was ultimately a contest of industrial capacity and technological sophistication, domains where Japan could not compete? The question became moot as the war ground on. By 1945, Japanese aviation fuel was so adulterated with substitutes that engines failed before altitude became the limiting factor. Pilots flew combat missions after fewer than 100 hours of training, barely able to take off and land, let alone engage in high-altitude intercepts. The oxygen debate faded, not because it was resolved, but because it became irrelevant against the backdrop of total systemic collapse. Saburo Sakai survived the war, one of the very few Japanese aces to do so. In the decades that followed, he became something of a celebrity in aviation history circles, attending air shows and reunions, meeting former American adversaries in carefully staged acts of reconciliation. In these encounters, he was inevitably asked about specific battles, about tactics, about the aircraft he flew. But in quieter moments, in the interviews that didn't make the highlight reels, he would return to the image that had stayed with him. That green tube running to an American pilot's face at 30,000 feet. "We were taught that the spirit could overcome the body," he said in a 1985 interview. And for a while, against some enemies, it seemed to be true. But then we encountered men who did not ask their spirit to overcome their body. They simply gave their body what it needed to function. And they were more dangerous because of it. They were not distracted by suffering. They could focus entirely on killing us. He paused, and the interviewer, a young American graduate student, asked if he thought the outcome of the war would have been different if Japan had prioritized pilot safety equipment earlier. Sakai smiled, the expression sad and knowing. "The oxygen was never really about breathing," he said. "It was about what kind of nation could afford to care whether its pilots breathed comfortably. We could not afford it, even if we had thought to try. And that was the answer to the war, right there. Not in the battles. In the oxygen bottles we did not have." There's a photograph taken in 1943 at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal that captures something of this divergence. In the foreground, a group of American pilots stands near a P-38 Lightning, casually leaning against the fuselage while maintenance crews work. One pilot is smoking. Another is reading a letter from home. Their oxygen masks dangle loosely from their helmets, rubber and canvas, and the green tubes trailing to the aircraft's life support system. The image radiates casual confidence. These are men performing a difficult job, certainly, but one that is well-supported, sustainable, part of an organized effort backed by seemingly infinite resources. In the background of the same photograph, barely visible, is the wreckage of a Zero fighter that crashed during a raid the previous night. The canopy is shattered. The cockpit is open to the elements. No oxygen equipment is visible in the debris because none existed. The contrast is unintentional, the juxtaposition accidental. But it tells the story as cleanly as any strategic analysis. Two nations at war, separated not just by ocean and ideology, but by fundamentally different assumptions about the value of human endurance versus human support. The Americans chose support. They built supply chains that could deliver oxygen bottles to jumbo airstrips 6,000 miles from California. They trained maintenance crews to serve as high-pressure regulators under combat conditions. They accepted the weight penalty, the logistical burden, the expense, because their calculation of warfare included keeping their men alive and effective as a primary rather than secondary concern. The Japanese chose endurance. They trained pilots to function beyond normal human limits. They emphasized spiritual development as a counter to material disadvantage. They built aircraft optimized for performance at the expense of survivability because they believed, deeply and genuinely, that the human spirit properly cultivated could overcome physical barriers. Both approaches had their logic. Both were coherent within their respective national contexts. but only one could sustain multi-year industrial warfare at global scale. The oxygen bottle endures in military aviation history as more than just equipment. It represents a threshold moment in the evolution of air combat, the point at which warfare moved decisively beyond the realm of individual skill and courage into domains where simple biological function required technological mediation. The samurai charging with sword drawn could not engage the enemy armed with rifles, no matter how pure his spirit. The pilot climbing to 30,000 feet without oxygen could not engage the enemy with pressurized breathing systems, no matter how extensive his training in deprivation. This was the fundamental shift that the Pacific Air War revealed. Modern combat was no longer a test of warrior virtue in any classical sense. It was a test of systemic capability, the ability of a nation-state to extend its industrial and technological reach into every aspect of military operation, down to the individual breath taken by a pilot in a freezing cockpit at the edge of the stratosphere. The nation that could supply oxygen won not because its pilots were braver or more skilled, but because its pilots were breathing. For Japan, this revelation came too late and at too high a cost. Thousands of aviators died in combat operations where their effectiveness was compromised by preventable physiological impairment. Thousands more survived the war with neurological damage from repeated hypoxic exposure, their post-war lives marked by cognitive deficits that were never officially acknowledged or compensated. The institutional knowledge that their suffering purchased, that industrial warfare rewards logistical abundance over individual sacrifice, was absorbed by the Japanese self-defense forces after 1945, though the lesson came hollow and bitter after defeat. For America, the oxygen system was simply one component among thousands in the vast machinery of mid-century military power. Its significance was never highlighted in propaganda or celebrated in war bond drives. Oxygen bottles were not glamorous. They did not photograph well. They represented the unglamorous work of keeping men alive rather than the exciting work of killing the enemy. But in the accounting of why one side prevailed and another collapsed, the green cylinders mounted in American cockpits carry weight far beyond their physical mass. They represented a nation that could afford to care about its warriors' survival, and that care, compounded across millions of small logistical decisions, became an insurmountable advantage. In the end, the Pacific Air War was decided by many factors: industrial capacity, strategic geography, cryptographic intelligence, naval supremacy, and the grim arithmetic of attrition. But within the individual encounters, the pilot-to-pilot duels at 30,000 feet where glory and terror mixed in equal measure, the outcome often came down to something as simple and profound as breathing. The side that solved the problem of breathing at altitude did not need to solve as many other problems. Their pilots arrived at combat altitude fresh, thinking clearly, capable of sustained effort. They could afford to be patient, to wait for the optimal firing solution, to break off and reset if the first pass failed. The side that did not solve that problem arrived at combat already compromised, already operating with impaired judgment and slowed reflexes, already fighting a two-front war against both the enemy and their own bodies. Courage could compensate for some of this. Exceptional skill could compensate for more. But month after month, engagement after engagement, the cumulative weight of that disparity ground down even the most determined resistance. When American forces finally occupied Japan in 1945, among the items cataloged in captured Japanese aircraft were the makeshift oxygen systems, crudely installed bottles with hand-soldered fittings, and improvised masks. American intelligence officers noted them in reports with a certain puzzlement. Why had these been added so late? Why so inconsistent in quality? The questions reflected a fundamental gap in understanding. To American analysts, oxygen systems were so basic, so obvious a requirement for high-altitude flight that their absence seemed almost incomprehensible. To Japanese engineers working with scraps of increasingly scarce material, oxygen bottles represented a luxury that the empire could afford only after it had already lost the war. That gap in perspective, The distance between seeing oxygen as basic equipment versus seeing it as luxury contained within it all the differences that mattered. One nation waged war from a position of such abundance that life support was standard. The other waged war from a position of such deprivation that breathing at altitude was an aspiration. The outcome was never really in doubt, though it took years of fighting for that truth to become undeniable. Today, oxygen systems in military aircraft are so universal and sophisticated that they barely merit discussion in tactical planning. Pilots in modern fighters operate routinely at 50,000 feet, supplied by on-demand flow systems that precisely meter oxygen based on altitude and breathing rate. The technology has advanced to the point of invisibility. It simply works, always, allowing human beings to function in an environment that would kill them in seconds without intervention. But there remains, in the history of how that technology came to be standard, a lesson about the nature of power in industrial warfare. True military superiority is not measured in the weapons that make headlines, the bombers, the carriers, the missiles that define public understanding of strength. It is measured in the 1,000 invisible systems that keep those weapons functioning. The supply chains, the maintenance protocols, the life support systems that allow human operators to sustain effort over time. The side that masters those mundane necessities, that can afford to build entire logistical infrastructures around keeping its people alive and effective, is the side that can sustain multi-year conflicts across hemispheres. The oxygen bottle at 30,000 feet was never just about breathing. It was about a nation demonstrating, in the most intimate possible way, that it valued its warriors' lives enough to burden its war machine with their survival. And in that demonstration lay a truth that no amount of courage or skill could overcome. That modern war is won not by the side willing to sacrifice most, but by the side that can afford to sacrifice least while still achieving its objectives. Japanese pilots who glimpsed those green tubes in American cockpits were seeing the future of warfare. A future where technology mediated every aspect of combat, where individual valor mattered less than systemic superiority, where the nation with deeper resources and broader industrial capacity would grind down any opponent regardless of spirit or determination. It was a future they could not win, and somewhere in the cold, thin air above the Pacific, watching American formations cruise effortlessly at altitudes that left them gasping and impaired, the best of them understood that. The war continued for 2 more years after that understanding took hold, driven by momentum and ideology and the brutal logic that armies in motion do not easily stop. But the outcome was sealed the moment it became clear that one side's pilots could breathe freely in the stratosphere, while the other side's pilots suffocated. Everything else was just the working out of that fundamental imbalance, written in contrails and wreckage across a burning sky. And in the quiet years that followed, when historians and veterans gathered to make sense of what had happened, they would sometimes speak of turning points and decisive battles, of Midway and the Marianas Turkey Shoot and the kamikaze campaigns. But the survivors who had been there, who had climbed into dying air and tried to fight men who carried their whole nation's industry in their cockpits, they understood. The war was lost not in any single battle, but in every moment a Japanese pilot climbed too high and felt his consciousness slipping away while his enemy, breathing easily, lined up the killing shot. That was defeat, not loud, not dramatic, just a slow suffocation in the sky, repeated until there was no one left to climb.